As we've had the chance to go through our study on different essential failures of the Christian life, we've had a chance to look at all different things that sometimes we find ourselves falling into. And today is no exception. Today we're going to talk about the failure to separate ourselves. And I think this is always a temptation for Christians. You see, we live in a world that is very different from who God calls us to be, that values very different things. And at times the temptation can be to just separate ourselves from it altogether, to take ourselves out of society and live in our own self-created bubbles. And the more society changes, the more I think we're tempted to do that. If you remember in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul, he goes to Athens. He looks around and he sees a culture that valued all the wrong things, and in a lot of ways was based on ignorance as to who the true God is. And we think about our culture, I don't think it's that different. In this chapter of our book, Chad Bird tries to Americanize that section. Here's his take on it. He says, "People of America, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked through your malls, watched your TV shows, observed your politics, and examined your sports, I found altars everywhere to known and unknown gods." You see, I think we do live in a culture that in a lot of ways has lost its moorings, that values all the wrong things, that flips everything on its head. And so what do? How do you hold on to your identity when you live in a world that tries to take it from you? How do you hold on to your Christian character when you live in a world that values all the wrong things? How do you remain the child of God? How can you be in the world but not of the world? It's easy sometimes to feel as if we do have to sequester ourselves, especially when you consider the fact that evil is not a static thing. Peter talks about that. It says in 1 Peter 2, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us." He's right. Temptation wars against our soul, and the more we find ourselves exposed to it, the more it can begin to eat away at our Christian character, the more it can drive a wedge between us and Christ. And throughout the ages, the temptation has always been to separate ourselves, to withdraw away from the rest of our culture, to decide that we're not going to interact with people that don't share our same values in any place in life. But you know, if we do that, we lose our opportunity to do what Peter talked about in the second half of that verse. And Jesus, he puts it more clearly. Here is his wish for us as we live in this world. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." You see, in the ancient world, salt was a preservative. And oftentimes when they gathered salt, they would get salt that was not completely pure, which meant that they would pack some meat in salt and then it would end up spoiling. And so what do you do with it then? If the salt can't preserve meat, you can't throw it in your garden, you can't use it for anything, all you can do is throw it out on the road. It's good for nothing. In the same way as Christians live their faith, they act as preservatives. But if we sequester ourselves away from the world, we don't have a chance to do that. We're not able to let that light shine, which is the next picture Jesus uses. He continues, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." God says Christians are like a city on a hill. And if you've ever been outside of a city at night and then looked and seen that city from the distance, you know you couldn't hide it if you tried. It just shines against the night sky. He says a Christian is like a lamp on a stand. You don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl. I mean, how many times did you give a flashlight to your kid and watch them turn it on and leave it under the bed and just let it run out of batteries? What a waste. You see, God has turned this light on in our hearts so we can show it to others. And so if we pull ourselves away from others, if we withdraw into our small little communities, if we fail to be there for our neighbors, we fail to be the lights God's called us to be. And there are some lies behind that approach. The idea that maybe it's not so much from in me where the evil comes, but from all these forces around us, fails to understand that at the end of the day, while the world may tempt me, and while the devil may bombard me with evil from outside, I am always my own worst enemy because of my sinful nature, and I can't run from that. There's this misunderstanding that maybe if we sequester ourselves in our own little bubbles, we can create heaven on earth, but we're not in heaven yet. And there's a misunderstanding that somehow if we separate ourselves from the world, we can sanctify ourselves, when there's only one thing that truly does that. Jesus talks about that in John 17. He says, I've given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I've sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. You see, we are in the world, but not of the world. And the secret to remaining God's children as we live in this world surrounded by evil is God's word. That's where God sanctifies us. That's where he sets us apart. That's where he draws us close to himself and keeps us as his own. Another important part of that is the value of Christian community. Consider what the writer of the Hebrews says. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. You see, being together with fellow Christians, gathering around word and sacrament, is how God builds us up in the faith, how he sanctifies us, sets us apart to be his own. And that's where he fuels us to go out into the world and be the children of God he's called us to be. We are in the world, but not of the world. And that presents challenges, and we ought to find a way to avoid temptation. We ought not allow evil just to exist next to us in a way that can draw us into its own darkness. But that doesn't mean that we pull ourselves away from the world. Today you'll have an opportunity in your groups to talk a little more about the challenges that are ours to be God's people living in the world, but not of the world, and the power of God to work through his word to set us apart for himself. God's blessings on your study.